Hi, and welcome to my channel. Here, you'll discover some of the most incredible events in history. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss anything, leave a like in advance, and enjoy the story. Among the 380 American flamethrower operators sent to Iwo Jima, only 18 managed to leave the island alive. Their life expectancy on the battlefield was measured in mere minutes, often just 4, and they were both feared and relied upon at the same time. Marines described them as the most devastating yet most vulnerable weapon in their arsenal. Their story, however, is darker and far more disturbing than it might first appear. And to see why, it is necessary to look at the larger picture of the Pacific War. When the Pacific Campaign is mentioned, people usually think of Guadalcanal or Okinawa, but Iwo Jima represented something different altogether. The island was a patch of volcanic rock less than 8 square miles in size, lying between the Marianas and mainland Japan. Despite its small size, in 1945 it became one of the most valuable pieces of territory in the entire conflict. The Americans saw it as vital because of its location. B-29 bombers flying from the Marianas to Japan passed directly over Iwo Jima, where Japanese radar and fighter aircraft could track and attack them. If the Americans seized the island, they could turn it into a forward base, allowing fighters to escort the bombers, providing a place for crippled planes to land and enabling shorter, more effective strikes with heavier payloads. The Japanese understood all of this just as clearly. They knew Iwo Jima was critical and that the Americans were bound to attack. But instead of defending it in the traditional way, they chose a new strategy. Earlier battles on islands such as Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu had shown that surface defenses were useless. Naval bombardments and airstrikes destroyed them long before Marines reached the shore. So on Iwo Jima, they went underground. General Taramichi Kuribayashi was appointed to command the defense. He was a seasoned officer who fully recognized the hopelessness of his position. He never expected to survive, nor did he believe Japan would win. His mission was to drag the fight out, inflict maximum casualties, and delay the American advance toward Japan's homeland. The longer his men held out, the more time Japan would gain to prepare for an inevitable invasion of its home islands. American intelligence believed there were about 13,000 defenders on Iwo Jima, but the actual number was closer to 23,000. Worse still, nearly all were deeply entrenched. More than 11 miles of tunnels were carved through the soft volcanic rock, which allowed fast excavation. These tunnels connected pillboxes, bunkers, machine gun nests, artillery positions, and storage depots. Kuribayashi ensured that every square yard of the island had been carefully pre-measured, with artillery zeroed in on the beaches and firing lanes overlapping each other. Unlike traditional battlefields, Iwo Jima had no clear front lines, only a network of positions supporting each other from different angles, with fallback routes underground. The American invasion began on February 19, 1945. As usual, it was preceded by days of heavy naval and aerial bombardment. Battleships and cruisers shelled the island relentlessly, leaving the coastline looking completely destroyed. But appearances were deceiving. The tunnels and fortifications had absorbed the damage, and most of the defenses remained intact. When the first waves of Marines stormed the beaches, they immediately faced another challenge. The black volcanic ash was soft and deep, sucking at their boots, stalling vehicles, and preventing them from digging in for cover. For nearly an hour after the landing, the beach remained eerily quiet. Marines tried to get organized and push inland, but suddenly the silence ended. Kuribayashi gave the signal, and a storm of machine guns, mortars, and artillery fire erupted. Every shot had been carefully aimed in advance, and the Marines found themselves trapped in clusters with no shelter. Casualties mounted at once. Still, inch by inch, the Americans fought forward. The deeper they advanced, the more they realized the scale of the Japanese defenses. Bunkers were destroyed with grenades or satchel charges, but too often Japanese troops would reappear from tunnels behind the Marines, firing from positions they thought had already been cleared. The battlefield dissolved into chaos, with no clear lines of control. The greatest obstacle remained the pillboxes. These reinforced concrete structures had small firing slits and overlapping fields of fire, protecting each other from multiple angles. Some were so well hidden that Marines could walk right past them without noticing until gunfire erupted. Destroying them was a nightmare. A Marine had to dash through a hail of bullets, reach an opening, and try to toss in a grenade or an explosive charge. But many of the pillboxes were designed in a zigzag fashion so that explosions would not clear the entire interior. Even after a blast, defenders could continue fighting.
In these situations, one weapon proved more effective than anything else, though at a terrible cost. The flamethrower became essential. Operators carried 70 pounds of equipment on their backs, 2 tanks filled with thickened gasoline, and a smaller tank of compressed nitrogen. The stream of fire could reach only about 20 yards, and a full load gave them 7 seconds of flame in total. To succeed, a Marine had to crawl within grenade range of a pillbox, unleash his short bursts, and hope he survived long enough to retreat and refill. The moment a flamethrower lit up, every Japanese defender concentrated fire on its operator. They knew what awaited them if he got close, and they spared no effort to kill him before that happened. For the Marine carrying the weapon, capture was often a fate worse than death. Flamethrower operators were hated and feared, and if taken alive, they could expect agonizing executions. One account tells of a Marine whose flamethrower jammed near a cave entrance. Japanese soldiers seized him and dragged him inside. His squad could hear his screams for 2 days, powerless to intervene or end his suffering. Stories like this revealed the horrors flamethrower operators faced, not only from the enemy, but also from the weapon itself, which could malfunction or even ignite accidentally, consuming its user. The psychological burden was immense. Operators were forced to witness, at point-blank range, the effects of their own weapons. The sound, the heat, the smell, the sight of destruction. Some used a tactic known as the wet burst, spraying fuel without igniting it, then following up with fire to ensure no one inside could return later. In confined spaces, temperatures could soar above 2,000 degrees in seconds, and oxygen was consumed instantly. Even without direct contact with the flames, survival inside a bunker was almost impossible. Videos and photographs from the aftermath still exist, though most who have studied them warn against looking. The violence of the weapon cannot be fully captured even on film. Operators were trained to take deep breaths before firing, because the roar of the flame and the blast of pressure made breathing impossible in those moments. Yet despite all the dangers and moral weight, the weapon remained one of the few tools that could consistently break the Japanese defenses. Because flamethrower operators were so vulnerable, the Marines soon sought a more durable solution. They introduced modified Sherman tanks, known as M4A3R3 flame tanks. Instead of a cannon, these machines carried a massive flamethrower system. From the outside, they looked like ordinary Shermans, but once they opened fire, they revealed their true purpose. Capable of projecting streams of flame up to 100 yards, they carried nearly 300 gallons of fuel, far more than a single man could carry. These tanks worked alongside infantry and conventional armor, blasting fortified positions that would have otherwise cost hundreds of lives to take. But, like the handheld flamethrowers, They also attracted enormous attention from defenders. A flame tank became an immediate priority target, and carrying such vast amounts of flammable fuel inside a metal shell was hardly comforting for the crews. Still, despite the risks, they were among the most effective weapons used on Iwo Jima. The combined efforts of Marines, flamethrower operators, and flame tanks eventually overwhelmed the defenders, but at almost an unimaginable cost. The island was taken, but the price in lives, on both sides, remains one of the most haunting chapters of the Pacific War. The story of the flamethrower operators, their near-suicidal missions, and the brutal realities they faced is a grim reminder of the extremes of human conflict.
After the arrival of flame tanks, Marines refined their assault drill until it resembled a brutal drill. Scouts crept forward to spot mines and suicide teams, then signaled the armor. Tanks nosed up to embrasures, sent an unlit spray to soak hidden galleries, and ignited the fuel with a short, savage burst. The flame reached deeper than grenades or satchel charges, curling around angles and swallowing pockets of air. Caves that had mocked weeks of bombardment finally fell silent, and the honeycombed slopes gave up ground yard by yard as exit after exit collapsed under heat and concussion. Tankers learned to pivot, fire, reverse, and fire again rather than pause. Lingering made them magnets for artillery and magnetic charges. Rifle squads wrapped the machines in a moving hedge of steel, cutting down runners who tried to slam close with mines. Machine gunners riddled firing slits. Snipers hunted observers peering from vents. Engineers followed with demolition to seal what the flame had cleared. In that cadence, the logic of heat was undeniable. Where interlocking pillboxes neutralized blast and shrapnel, fire conquered shape itself by stealing breath and eating the air. The cost remained awful. Crews lived with the knowledge that a single hit could turn their hull into a furnace. Men who carried flame on foot felt the weight of 70 pounds biting their shoulders and the weight of responsibility biting harder. They adopted rituals to keep panic at bay. Cleaning nozzles in obsessive cycles, checking valves twice, tapping gauges before each run. Corpsmen treated burns and smoke injuries with scant supplies, while chaplains moved from foxhole to foxhole, hearing confessions no one would speak aloud in daylight. The island's smell, sulfur, oil, and scorched rock worked into clothing and thoughts alike. Coordination improved as the weeks wore on. Forward observers registered exits on maps smudged with ash. Demolition teams trailed tanks closely, ready to drop charges before defenders crept back through labyrinthine passages. Portable flamethrowers, though few, still worked beside the armor, using cold sprays followed by ignition so that no one could reoccupy a cave after the line passed. When heat collapsed a tunnel, Marines marked the spot and posted guards, knowing the island still held roots they had not found. Every footstep suggested a void beneath. As resistance thinned, the campaign's strategic payoff became obvious. Damaged bombers began landing on the island's airstrips instead of vanishing into the ocean. Fighter escorts operating from Iwo Jima stretched protection over missions to the mainland, reducing losses and tightening the noose. The argument for capturing a rock midway between the Marianas and Japan was no longer theoretical. Even while firefights flickered in ravines, the island was already doing the job for which men had bled. When the firing finally ebbed, very few of the original defenders remained alive. For the Marines, the price was written in casualty lists and in the faces of those who had carried flame or driven the tanks that hurled it. Some avoided the subject for the rest of their lives. Others spoke bluntly, believing that plain truth, however grim, was a better memorial than forgetting. They remembered the roar that smothered breath, the greasy smoke, the hush when fire stripped oxygen from a chamber. They remembered the sudden return of sound, the scrape of boots, and the clink of cooling metal. In the years after, certain smells or a hard, hot wind could return them to a corridor of rock glowing with reflected fire. Their work was necessary and decisive. It had also been scarring. The island continued to save air crews who never learned the names of the men who burned open its tunnels. That was also part of the truth. Victory had been bought with minutes measured in flame, and for those who paid them out, the clock never completely stopped. They kept marching forward, but the echoes followed them back home, always.
When the battle finally drew to a close, the island had been transformed into a landscape of ash, twisted metal, and silence. Nearly all of the 23,000 Japanese defenders were dead, and the Marines had paid one of the steepest prices of the entire Pacific campaign. For many Americans, the capture of Iwo Jima symbolized not only a tactical victory, but also the extraordinary human cost of fighting an enemy determined to resist until the last man. The flag raised on Mount Suribachi became an enduring image of triumph. Yet for those who fought there, the memory was darker and far more complicated. Flamethrower operators, whether carrying the portable M2 or serving inside armored Shermans, had borne an especially heavy share of that burden. They had advanced with almost no expectation of survival, targeted by every enemy rifle, machine gun, and mortar. Their work was essential for breaking defenses that bombs and shells could not reach, yet they carried with them an indelible sense of dread and guilt. Many later spoke of how the flame became part of their nightmares, how they could never truly escape the roar and the heat, even years after the war ended. The Japanese defenders who endured the flame remembered it with equal horror. Testimonies that survived described the terrifying sight of fire pouring into caves and tunnels, the suffocating heat, and the certainty that no escape was possible. For some, suicide seemed preferable to waiting for fire to consume the air itself. General Kuribayashi's strategy had delayed the Americans and inflicted terrible losses, but the arrival of flamethrowers and flame tanks ensured that no defensive line, however well prepared, could hold indefinitely. From a purely military perspective, the capture of Iwo Jima accomplished exactly what the planners had hoped. The island's airstrips quickly became vital to the bombing campaign against Japan. Damaged B-29s returning from missions landed there by the thousands, sparing the lives of air crews who otherwise would have been lost at sea. Fighter escorts flying from the island shielded bombers as they pressed deeper into Japanese skies. In this sense, the bloodshed had a measurable outcome, and the ground won at such terrible cost directly contributed to the eventual end of the war. But for the men who had fought with flame, the legacy was not measured in strategy. It lived in scars, in memories, and in the silence that followed them home. Some rarely spoke of what they had done, finding no words that could explain it. Others tried to share, bluntly and without comfort, believing that only truth could honor the dead. They described the suffocating roar, the pressure in their chests when the igniter lit, the feeling of air itself being stolen from around them. They recalled comrades engulfed when fuel tanks ruptured, or the chilling knowledge of what awaited if captured alive. Historians later debated the morality of flame weapons, pointing out the suffering they inflicted, yet few denied their effectiveness on Iwo Jima. Against an enemy dug into concrete and rock, determined to fight underground, no other tool achieved the same results. In a battle where conventional firepower had reached its limits, the flamethrower forced progress where none seemed possible. That was the paradox faced by those who carried it. The weapon that gave their comrades a chance to advance was also the weapon that condemned them to be the first and most obvious target.
As the Pacific Campaign moved on toward Okinawa and ultimately toward the prospect of invading Japan itself, the lessons of Iwo Jima remained fresh. Commanders recognized both the value and the terrible cost of flame weapons. More tanks were modified, more training provided, but nothing could erase the truth that each operator carried a burden no one else could fully share. For those who survived, the war did not end with surrender. It lived on in their dreams, their silences, and in the uneasy gratitude of bomb crews who landed safely on the runways they had won. Looking back, Iwo Jima stands as both triumph and tragedy. It showed the power of determination, the ingenuity of defense, and the extremes of human endurance. Yet it also revealed how war strips away illusions, leaving only the raw struggle to survive and to overcome. The story of the flamethrower operators, their minutes of life measured in bursts of fire, remains one of the starkest reminders of what it cost to capture that small black island in the middle of the Pacific.
In the aftermath of Iwo Jima, when the smoke cleared and the guns finally fell silent, the Marines who had survived tried to make sense of what they had endured. For many, the memories were sharper than any medal or headline. They remembered comrades who had vanished in bursts of machine gun fire, men who had carried flamethrowers knowing they were marked for death, and the suffocating black sand that swallowed boots and vehicles as if the island itself wanted to consume them. Victory had been achieved, but it was written in a language of fire, ash, and sacrifice. The symbolism of the flag on Mount Suribachi captured the imagination of the American public. Photographs showed triumph, unity, and determination. Yet for those on the ground, that moment was not the end, but merely a pause in the nightmare. Fighting continued for weeks after the famous image, as Japanese defenders in tunnels and caves resisted until the very last. Marines who saw the flag raised knew that dozens more strongpoints still waited ahead, and that every step forward would cost more blood. Among the stories whispered by survivors, the accounts of flamethrower operators remained the most haunting. They told of approaching pillboxes through storms of bullets, igniting nozzles while praying the tanks on their backs would not rupture, and seeing positions erupt into fire so intense that stone itself glowed red. They described nights when the sky flickered with burning caves, days when the battlefield smelled of gasoline and sulfur, and hours when the air was so hot it seemed to vibrate. Those memories followed them into peacetime, shadows they could never fully shake. Psychologists after the war noted that flamethrower men often suffered some of the worst post-traumatic stress. They had confronted the enemy at the closest range possible, forced to witness every detail of the destruction their weapon caused. Unlike a rifleman who fired at a silhouette hundreds of yards away, the operator knew exactly what his flame did inside a confined space. The screams, the silence that followed, and the knowledge that he alone carried the weapon that made such horrors possible, left scars that lasted decades. Some veterans refused to discuss it even with family, while others spoke only in fragments, as if words themselves could not contain what they had seen. Japanese survivors, though few, left testimonies that echoed this anguish. They recalled the terror of hearing the hiss of ignited fuel, the impossible heat in bunkers, and the desperate choices between suffocation, immolation, or suicide. For them, too, fire became the defining memory of the battle. General Kuribayashi's defense had been ingenious, and his soldiers fought with remarkable discipline, but against flamethrowers and flame tanks, the underground fortress could not hold forever. Eventually, the island fell silent, its defenders reduced to ashes and collapsed stone. Strategically, the sacrifice was vindicated by what followed. Thousands of American airmen owed their lives to Iwo Jima's airstrips.
Damaged bombers diverted there rather than ditch into the ocean, and fighters launched from its runways shielded the massive raids against Japan. Every landing reinforced the argument that the island had been worth the cost, at least in the cold calculations of war planners. But for the Marines who had lived through it, no strategic advantage could balance the faces of those left behind in the volcanic sand. As the war moved toward Okinawa and the looming invasion of the Japanese homeland, the lessons of Iwo Jima influenced every decision. Commanders saw that the enemy would not break easily, that underground fortifications would demand even more brutal tactics, and that flamethrowers would remain essential despite their horror. At the same time, there was growing awareness of just how devastating such battles would be if repeated on the scale of the main islands. That recognition, combined with the desire to end the conflict swiftly, shaped the final, fateful choices that brought the Pacific War to its close. In the decades since, veterans of Iwo Jima have spoken at reunions, memorials, and classrooms. Some tried to convey the reality of what had happened, while others remained silent, letting monuments and photographs speak in their place. The story of the flamethrower operators, measured in minutes of life and gallons of fire, has become one of the starkest illustrations of sacrifice in modern war. Their courage was not in the expectation of survival, but in their willingness to advance anyway, carrying a weapon that made them targets, knowing that each step forward might be their last. Today, when people remember Iwo Jima, they think of the flag, the black sand, and the Marines who never returned. Yet behind every symbol lies the reality of men who fought with fire, who carried unbearable risks, and who lived or died in a battle where survival itself was a victory.
The story of Iwo Jima and the men who carried fire on their backs is not just history. It is a reminder of what war truly costs. On that small island of black sand, courage was measured in minutes, and survival was never guaranteed. Every flame that lit the tunnels also lit a chapter of sacrifice that still deserves to be remembered today. If you want to keep these stories alive, stories of soldiers, weapons, and the choices that shaped our world, stay with us. Subscribe, support our work, and help us continue to bring the past into the present. Every voice matters, every memory counts, and together we can make sure none of them are lost.